Alex Eala torna in campo per iniziare la sua preparazione in vista della stagione sul cemento degli US Open.
There's a part of the New York metropolitan area that most people never think about as a city of its own. It stretches through Queens, Jersey City, parts of Long Island, and the northern edge of Bergen County. And across those communities, roughly 262,000 people share something remarkable. Their family roots trace back to the Philippines. 262,000 people. That is larger than the population of Buffalo. Larger than Orlando. In other words, there is essentially a mid-sized American city living quietly inside the New York metropolitan area. And this community did not grow because of tennis. For decades, Filipinos came to New York and New Jersey searching for opportunity. Some arrived for nursing careers. Others came for engineering, healthcare, business, and other professions. Many followed family members through reunification programs that opened doors in the 1970s and 1980s. They came looking for something simple but powerful, a better life. And now, decades later, something extraordinary is about to happen. A 21-year-old left-handed tennis star named Alex is arriving in New York for the 2026 US Open, but she is not arriving alone. She is stepping into a region where hundreds of thousands of people already feel a connection to her story. For many of them, Alex is more than another tennis player walking onto a court. She represents a new generation. A generation that grew up between two worlds, carrying Filipino roots while building lives in America. And when Alex walks into New York, that entire community is going to notice. The city inside the city is ready to welcome her into.
Mi fanno sentire sempre più speciale, sapete? Essere filippina è qualcosa di cui vado molto fiera.
Not quietly, not from a distance. The videos are already spreading across social media. The dramatic headlines, the viral clips, the footage that keeps appearing on your feed. Everywhere Alex goes, people seem to gather. Phones go up, cameras start recording, and Filipino flags that were packed away in backpacks suddenly come out. At first, it is easy to look at those scenes and think one thing: Alex built this. She created the fan base, she created the excitement, she turned herself into a star. But before we accept that explanation, there is a much bigger question hiding underneath it. What if Alex isn't actually building a fan base in New York? What if she is simply walking into one that was already there? Because long before Alex stepped onto a tennis court in New York, hundreds of thousands of Filipino Americans were already living, working, raising families, and building communities across this region. They were there quietly. They were waiting, and now suddenly they have a reason to come together. So maybe what we're watching isn't the creation of a new fan base at all. Maybe we're watching an existing community finally find someone to rally behind.
Un torneo di casa, quindi sono così grata che mi facciano sentire come se fossi a casa mia.
That question matters more than whether Alex wins her opening round. It matters more than her seeding, more than her draw, and in a strange way, even more than the tennis itself. Because if Alex built this following from the ground up, then we already know the story. It is the familiar story of a young star exploding onto the scene, going viral, winning big matches, and slowly building a passionate fan base around her talent. We have seen that story before, but what if that is not what is happening here? What if the crowd was already there? What if what looks like a sudden explosion of fandom is actually something much deeper, a homecoming? And if that is the case, then this is no longer just a story about tennis. It becomes a story about a community scattered across cities and states, suddenly finding a reason to gather around one person standing on a tennis court. It becomes a story about representation, not as a slogan, but as thousands of people filling stadiums, raising flags, and saying in their own way, one of us is finally here. And that story is worth staying for. So if you care about the moments when sports become something bigger than the scoreboard, stay with me because the most important part of this story comes later. First, let's get our feet on the ground. Alex is 21 years old. She's left-handed, stands 5'9", and trains at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca. And in August 2026, she carries a career-high WTA ranking of world number 20. On August 3rd, she defeated world number 3 Jessica Pegula in a rain-delayed final at the Mubadala DC Open in Washington. That victory made her the first player from the Philippines to win a WTA Tour singles title. Think about that for a second. And the first. Now she arrives at the 2026 US Open in New York, one of the biggest stages in tennis, carrying not only the expectations of a young star, but the attention of an enormous Filipino community. That is the tennis story. But the tennis alone doesn't explain what is happening around her. And that brings us to the first clue. On August 3rd, during that historic DC Open final, Alex was playing in her first WTA 500 final and was one set away from winning the biggest title of her career. Yet inside the roughly 7,500 seat stadium, the atmosphere was unmistakable. Filipino flags were everywhere. Fans stood and applauded whenever she walked toward her chair during changeovers. The crowd wasn't simply watching her, it was emotionally invested in her. So ask yourself something. How do you create that kind of support before you've even won a WTA Tour title? How do the flags appear? How do the tickets get organized? How do people travel? How does an entire community mobilize around a player before she has even lifted her first tour trophy? That is the question we need to answer. Because the second clue makes the situation even stranger. Jessica Pegula lost that final. She was the world number 3. She was American. She was playing on American soil. And yet, after losing to Alex, Pegula reportedly gained thousands of new Filipino followers. Think about how unusual that is. Normally, when your favorite player loses, you don't immediately rush to follow the person who defeated them. You don't suddenly embrace the winner's supporters. But that is what makes Alex's situation different. So what exactly were those people following? Alex the tennis player? Or something bigger? Then comes the third clue. Weeks before the DC Open final, Alex appeared at fan events in Manila. At Nike Ford in Bonifacio Global City and later at the Globe Tower, crowds waited for hours. They stood in the heat. They formed long lines. And they weren't waiting for a trophy Alex had already won. She hadn't won it yet. They weren't celebrating a ranking that had already reached its peak. That hadn't happened either. They were there because, in their minds, something had already been decided. They had already claimed her as one of their own. And that brings us to the fourth clue. Alex enters the 2026 US Open ranked number 20 in the world. That is an extraordinary achievement. There are only 19 women ranked above her. But here's the important part. Many of those 19 players are global stars. Many have Grand Slam experience. Many have enormous international followings. Yet most of them won't arrive in a foreign city and find an entire community treating their appearance like a family gathering. Most won't see entire sections of a stadium transformed by flags from their home country. Most won't cause an opponent to gain thousands of new followers from the winner's homeland. So the ranking cannot explain this. Something else is driving it. And I think we have been looking at that something from the wrong angle. Maybe we've been assuming that Alex is building a fan base the same way every young tennis star does. Match by match, win by win, milestone by milestone. That is how we normally understand fandom. A player performs, people notice, the player becomes more successful, more people follow. Eventually, the audience explodes. It is a familiar pattern, but Alex's story doesn't quite fit that pattern. Because the community surrounding her did not suddenly appear after her biggest victories. It was there before them. It was there before her first WTA main draw, before her junior Grand Slam success, before she became a household name. In the New York metropolitan area alone, the Filipino community numbers in the hundreds of thousands. And within New York City itself, a substantial Filipino population is concentrated in places like Queens. Queens is not some distant corner of the country. It is minutes from Flushing Meadows, minutes from the US Open. These are people who were already there. They were working, raising families, building businesses, going to church, creating community organizations, sending money home, building lives in America while keeping their connection to the Philippines alive. Alex didn't create those networks. She didn't summon them into existence. She gave them something to gather around. And that is a completely different thing. There is a huge difference between building an audience and being received by a community that already exists. Once you understand that difference, every image of Alex in New York starts to look different. The flags don't simply look like merchandise. The chants don't simply look like fan club activity. The crowds don't simply look like people chasing a celebrity. They start to look like a community welcoming someone who represents home. And there is evidence that supports this interpretation. Start with the numbers. The Filipino population across the New York metropolitan area represents a community that has existed for generations. Within New York City, thousands of Filipino families have built their lives in neighborhoods such as Queens. The community existed long before Alex picked up a tennis racket. Filipino grocery stores existed. Churches existed. Community associations existed. Family networks existed. Messaging groups existed. The infrastructure was already there. Alex simply gave all of those separate networks a reason to converge. That distinction matters. Because she didn't build the road, she became the destination. And then there is Alex's own voice. After winning the DC Open on August 3rd, she spoke about the messages she had received from family and friends around the world. She described feeling an overwhelming amount of love. And the most important part of what she said was that regardless of what happened in the final, she already felt that the experience was a win. Think about that word, already, before the final result, before the trophy, before the celebration. The love was already there. She wasn't describing something she had just acquired. She was describing something she had already felt. And that is exactly why the idea of a homecoming feels so powerful. Alex wasn't walking into an empty room and convincing people to care. She was walking into a room where people were already waiting. She has also spoken positively about the atmosphere in New York, describing the people and the energy as something different from other places. And perhaps that is the key. The people were already there. Alex simply finally had a reason to meet them on the biggest stage. But there is another moment that makes this even more interesting. Jessica Pegula. After losing the DC Open final, Pegula reportedly gained thousands of Filipino followers. Stop there. Let that sink in. The player who lost gained supporters from the country of the player who beat her. That doesn't fit neatly into the usual definition of fandom, because fandom is often built around loyalty. If your favorite loses, you normally don't celebrate the person who defeated them. But what happened here suggests something different. The Filipino audience wasn't simply watching a tennis match. They were watching one of their own step onto a global stage. And suddenly, everyone around that player became part of the story. Even the opponent. Pegula wasn't necessarily being rejected. She was being absorbed into the moment. And that tells us something important. Maybe this isn't simply tennis fandom. Maybe tennis is the medium. Maybe the bigger story is a community seeing itself represented through one athlete. And that is why those videos from New York feel so different. The flags, the crowds, the phones held high, the people waiting outside. At first glance, it can look like a celebrity being mobbed by fans. But perhaps that is the wrong way to describe it. Maybe it is closer to a homecoming. You don't mob someone you already consider family. You wait for them. You welcome them. You make sure they know they were expected. Now there's an important reality check here. None of this guarantees that Alex will win the US Open. It doesn't guarantee that she'll win her first round match. It doesn't tell us who she will face. And it certainly doesn't mean the crowd can win matches for HM. Tell us who she will face. And it certainly doesn't mean the crowd can win matches for HM.